evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we should start. I want to welcome you all in the name of the Namibian Scientific Society. I'm Bertien Kors, I'm one of the board members. We will have a special treat today because we will have enjoyed two different talks from two different speakers, and they are both talking about the future of Namibia's forest. Just a short while ago, we decided to turn it around. The second speaker will be talking first, and the first speaker second, for good reasons. Before I introduce the first speaker, which will be Dr. Chris Brown, I want to make some announcements. First of all, the next talk will be on the 13th of September, but this is not the Scientific Society. It will be here, but it's by news. And Mr. Tom Hoffman will speak about dogs at work. The next talk on the Namibian, or rather a launch of a book by the Namibian Scientific Society, is the book of Maria Fish, Hambukushu, the Hambukushu of Namibia's Kwango East region. We have waited a long time for this book, and we are very, very glad that it can be launched now. I'm sure it will be a wonderful book. Then I want to thank Miriam for doing the technique. And in the back, you know, you can get some drinks. We are not allowed to take any money for the drinks, so but we are very happy about some donations. Yeah, now I want to introduce Dr. Chris Brown, but I think he doesn't really need an introduction. Everyone knows Dr. Chris Brown. He has been in former times the Director of Environmental Affairs of the Ministry of Environment and Tourism, which is now Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism. And Dr. Chris Brown is now the CEO of the Namibian Chamber of Environment. We know it as NCE. He will talk about the state of Namibia's northeastern forest and woodlands and how to protect and restore forest cover. Chris, the floor is on you. And sorry, one more announcement. When you have some questions, please ask for the microphone, because this is online and people cannot hear if you talk in the big. People cannot hear, so please ask for the microphone. Okay, Chris.
Thank you. Where do I need to stand? Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to come and talk today. Can you hear? Okay. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me here this evening. Forests, forest cover, and timber extraction has been a topical subject for quite a few years now, and a rather sad subject. So I want to talk about the situation of forests and what we can do to improve forest cover in Namibia. Now, if we look here, we see that back in 2005, the then Minister of Agriculture and Forestry said, it's imperative that Namibia finds ways to halt deforestation so that it can prevent and halt desertification. Since then, 17 years have passed, and Namibia has made no progress. I've been polite there and said little progress, but we've made no progress. In fact, we've gone backwards. Things are worse. Why is this? We do a lot of talking in Namibia, particularly in government circles, a lot of talking, but we do very little action. And this is part of the problem that goes right across the board. Now, I'm going to be talking about forestry and forest and timber in the beginning. but I've got a couple of slides I add on at the end, because this forestry sector, I believe, is a corrupt sector, or has been a corrupt sector. And if there's anyone who disagrees with me, I'd like to hear why you think different. So at the end, I talk a little bit about corruption, which goes broader than forests. I talk about the fishing sector and the institutional mechanisms and a range of issues, and we talk about what we can do about that. And I think that's really important. And I'm writing something on this right at the moment, so I'm kind of using you as a sounding board to see what you think about what I have to say. So let's crack on with the forestry side. Why are we losing forests and woodland in Namibia? There are a number of key areas why this is happening. The first one is land use change, where we have subsistence cropping, slash and burn, clearing an area, planting for maybe 2 or 3 years, and then the nutrients are used up, and then you slash and burn another sector and you plant, and you keep going like that, and you just open up the woodlands. The second area are things like green schemes. Now, we've got in the order of 27,000 hectares of cleared land for green schemes, which are running at a severe loss and are actually contributing very little to the Namibian economy. They're not providing food security for us because they're mismanaged, badly managed. The people who run them don't know what they're doing. And then we've got some mining impacts as well. At the moment, we've got Recon Africa doing things in the Kavongo region, which they really shouldn't be doing. They shouldn't be here in Namibia. They're a con crowd. There's no oil or gas there. It's all stock market exploration that they're doing, and yet we allow them to do it. The second broad area is cutting trees for building homesteads and livestock kraals, and for logging, timber export. And everyone's aware of the logging problems we've had, and that's where the corruption, incompetence in the extreme, plus corruption came in, with all this exports of timber to China. We've got a situation of rising global temperatures, which result in lower rainfall. This map here, this graph, shows the temperatures in Namibia from 1900 to 2020. And you can see the temperatures below the line are cooler and above the line, and that leaves very little doubt as to what's been happening in Namibia temperature-wise. Our increase in temperature now is almost at 2 degrees compared to the pre-industrial revolution times. The rest of the world is at about 1.4, 1.6 degrees. We are hotter. We've increased faster than most of the world. And those little maps there show the rainfall ISO heights. That's the current situation, or in 2010. And that red line there identifies the ISO heights below which commercial large stock farming is not possible, and people move across to small stock. The black line up there shows the rain-fed cropping, where you can plant mahongo, where it's worth planting mahongo. South of that, if you put a pip in the ground, the chances are it'll die. You won't have enough rain to raise a mahongo crop. And by 2045, you can see where those lines have moved up to. And by 2065, you can see where they're going to be moving up to. So you can see that rainfall, the country is getting hotter and it's getting drier, with those rainfall ISO heights moving to the north and east. So when we talk about woodland, we're talking here about deciduous woodland, woodland on Kalahari sand. We're not talking about the savanna thornfelt system. We're talking about the deciduous woodland system. Less than 9% of Namibia is covered by that deciduous woodland, or so-called forests. It's not true forest, it's open woodland. Between 1990 and 2010, we lost about 1.5 million hectares of woodland. That's about 17%. And since then, the loss has accelerated, and we've now lost between 25 and 30% of our woodland to date. That's where we stand. And things haven't stopped. We've stopped some of the more obvious logging and export, but a lot of it hasn't changed. So we need to do something serious about this. Let me just go back. Another problem is excessive fires. Fires are very important for African ecosystems, savanna and woodland ecosystems. They're an integral part of our savanna ecosystems. But excessive fires are not good. And too few fires are also not good. Depends on your management practices, but fires are an important part of African ecosystems. And then the last point here is poverty. When people are poor, they have few options. Now that often raises eyebrows. And I want to talk to you about this, the Kuznets curve. And it's something that is really important to understand. When a country becomes more wealthy and per capita income goes up, that causes problems. It causes problems, for example, you start having disposable income, you go to the shop, you buy things, you throw the plastic away. You have a litter problem. You start having little factories. The factories put their waste and effluent into the local river. You have pollution. And the problems escalate and escalate as a country becomes more wealthy. But as a country becomes more wealthy, it also learns to deal with those problems. And so your problem starts, it goes up, and then your increase in wealth allows you to deal with it. And the next problem starts, goes up, and you deal with it. And the next problem, and Namibia now is in many cases in that state. Is in that stage there where we've got problems and we haven't got over them yet. And forest deforestation is one, climate change is another. There are a whole range of problems there. But if you just think of waste, in the affluent parts of Namibia, like in Klein Windhoek, you don't have much of a litter problem. You go into the poorer areas in Katatura and particularly in the informal settlements, you have a massive problem, and so on. So you have this situation where you have environmental worsens and then it starts improving again. Now, in much of the developed world, they've actually got more forests today than they had 50 years ago. In the US, and Canada, and parts of Western Europe, and so on, they lost a lot of their forests, and now they are getting over the hump, and they're starting to develop, increase their forest cover. Now, if you look in Namibia, what's interesting what's happened here. This is up in the north central. This is the Vomberland. And that line there, this was taken near independence. That line there is the line between Angola and Namibia. And there's the Kunene coming down. And there's Ogongo Agricultural College, that little patch there. And that's what it looks like now. There's the borderline between Ogongo and the communal areas. And this here, the woodlands protected, and there it isn't. And what caused this was largely that. Building palisades and homesteads out of timber, and then of course firewood and so on. And these were very big, extensive systems here. And what's happening today is you hardly see a homestead built in the traditional way in the north central anymore. It's mainly blocks, concrete blocks or bricks, and that's most of the development up there for homesteads. And we're actually seeing, in the north central, in the Vomberland, we're actually seeing a regeneration of the forest. The forest cover is better today than it was 20 years ago by quite a bit, and it's expanding and improving all the time. And that's because people in the north have a disposable income and they're investing not in traditional houses, but in new modern houses, and the pressure is off. And that's an example of that curve that we were talking about. But as I said, many higher income countries are increasing their forest cover. USA, Canada, most Western countries, even China. But what those buggers are doing is coming to Africa and depleting our forests, right across Africa, and we let them do it. It was taken in 1989. It was a satellite, it's from a satellite image. So why is it important to stop deforestation and to reverse the process? The most important issue at this time is climate regulation. Carbon storage and regulating temperature and precipitation, the microclimatic impacts that it has. Also, of course, are environmental benefits and services, biodiversity, ecosystems, landscapes, habitats, corridors, connectivity, water purification, water filtration, soil protection. And then social value. 65% of Namibians depend to a greater or lesser extent, many much lesser extent if they're urban, but they always have food sent down to town and so on. They're dependent on forests and non-timber forest products. There's great heritage value, there's recreational value, and of course there's commercial value, timber and non-timber forest products, crafts and tourism. The value of forests across the whole globe is estimated at between 50 and 150 trillion US dollars, and most of that value comes from carbon storage for climate. And that's greater than all the stock exchanges, all the stock markets in the world combined. That's the value of forests to this planet. So I said, we talk too much and we do too little. What are the headline actions of what we should be doing? The first thing that we should be doing is not confusing bush thinning, debushing, with deforestation. We have had a huge problem in Namibia here with a number of Herr Doctor professors from Germany using a local Namibian NGO as a mouthpiece for them. That's confused that and set back our bush thinning program in Namibia. A huge problem. We mustn't confuse the two. Bush thinning takes place mainly on thornfelt savanna ecosystems, and that is rangeland restoration that we're talking about here. And the interesting thing here is that that rangeland needs to be restored because of Eurocentric agricultural farming practices that were brought into Namibia and the exclusion of fire from rangelands. And the descendants of those people who did that are now telling us we can't restore our rangelands because it's debushing. It's deforestation. That has been a major problem in Namibia. Deforestation here happens in the deciduous woodlands of north and northeast Namibia. So we need to get those two things separated out, debushing and deforestation. The second thing is we need to stop current deforestation through better fire management and through protecting areas to allow natural regeneration. We need to look at implementing an active, dynamic, and multi-agency reforestation program with mainly indigenous tree species. And why do I say a multi-agency reforestation program? Because the Directorate of Forestry is incapable of doing that. They don't have the fire in the belly, they don't have the ability, they don't have the enthusiasm, they have nothing that will make that happen. So we need to set up mechanisms that will allow a collective approach, a multi-agency approach to deal with this. These are the areas that I suggest we should start with: the riverbanks, the roadways which enter into areas where you have settlements, abandoned crop fields, around green schemes, around villages, schools, and in urban areas. That could be the start of a reforestation program in the Northeast. So I've got some recommendations here to reduce deforestation. And the first one is there should be no commercial harvesting of timber unless there's been a thorough, transparent, and verifiable resource assessment to determine what the sustained yield would be. And secondly, there should be no export of raw timber. And that includes planks and squared logs and various things which are just subtle variations on raw timber. And all that timber, if we do harvest, and there is a harvestable quota, all that timber should have value addition in Namibia for furniture and related goods. We need to set up an effective national fire management program for the Northeast. We need to support and expand the community forestry program to make it far more effective than it is at the moment and integrate it better with conservancies. We need to proclaim, protect, and manage 3 state forests, including the Caprivi forest, which have been on Namibia's maps for the last 30 years, and then suddenly forestry found they hadn't been proclaimed and there was no legal standing to them and there's no management around them. It's just pathetic beyond words, it really is. Anyway, that needs to be done, and we need to be finding new areas of woodland and forest which we could be identifying and proclaiming as part of a national forest protection network around the country. Now, very, very importantly, to stop the slash and burn program, we should be supporting and driving a minimum tillage agriculture, conservation agriculture program, where you're enriching people's crop fields and improving their crop production rather than moving and moving and moving to new areas all the time because the soils are depleted. That will stop a lot of the deforestation which is taking place at the moment. In terms of reforestation, we need to set up a national reforestation program with a clear action plan, selected priority sites, bringing together the right stakeholders, making annual provision in the national budget, building reforestation into talks with bilateral and multilateral partners, and engaging the private sector through incentives. We should be exploring carbon credits, and I won't go into that because our next speaker will be talking about that. And we need to set up an urban tree planting and protection program. 53% of Namibians now live in urban areas. And if every family planted just 4 trees, we'd have 1 million trees in our urban areas. And we should be clever about it. We should be providing the right sorts of trees for each of the towns which are appropriate to their ecological setting. And our local authorities and municipalities should be giving us discounts on our municipal fees for every tree on our plot we have at the end of every year. We need to create these incentives to make things work. And then I've got some general recommendations for forestry. And the first one is to set up a National Forest and Woodland Council for Namibia. The Directorate of Forestry can provide the secretariat to it, but we bring a lot of people together from different sectors to make this thing work. We need to set up an effective forest cover monitoring system. The Directorate of Forestry, just after independence, had a very good remote sensing unit, which was funded by the Finns and a range of other people. It was the best GIS system in Namibia. And it's just been allowed to disappear. We mustn't set up another one in the Directorate of Forestry because they will allow it to disappear as well. We need to get groups of people together, universities and so on, to set these sorts of things up and be accountable to that National Forest and Woodland Council so that accountability is kept. That monitoring system should be tracking deforestation, natural regeneration, and reforestation annually across the country. And they should be reporting annually to Parliament and to the general public to tell us where we stand. I've now spoken to Parliament on 2 occasions, both houses of Parliament coming together. And it was alarming at how little people were aware of the deforestation and the timber exploitation and the corruption issues happening in the country. Absolutely amazing. And how little background there was on issues like climate change and so on. So we need to be making this information much more accessible and making our parliamentarians and our leaders far more aware of the situation. We need to be building an additional funding mechanism from key carbon dioxide contributing industries. A small proportion of the current levy on fuel should go into this forestry program. I'm not saying we should add an extra levy on. There's a lot of levy money coming off, and some of it should be spent on this sort of thing. Air travel in and out of Namibia should attract compulsory carbon offset payments built into your ticket, and now those funds should be ring-fenced for climate change investment, including restoring and protecting forests and woodlands. And political engagement, support and accountability in this sector has been totally inadequate to date. politicians need to take far more responsibility and oversight that these things are done properly. So I've said thank you because that was the end of part 1, but I want to just go on to part 2, which talks about some of the broader corruption issues and just get your view on the approach which I'm taking here. I'm in the process of writing something on this at the moment, so I'm shamelessly using you as a sounding board. So part 2 is corruption. And a lot of my work on this to date has been through the lens, if you like, of the fishing sector, the fish rot work. And my conclusion here is that economic corruption, a la fish rot, and natural resource management inadequacies, mismanagement of natural resources, are two sides of the same coin. They have the same root causes that result in them happening. Now, if you look at this graph, the red lines there, that is the pilchard or sardine biomass off the Namibian coast in 1970. 11 million tons of sardines. Today, we've got 50,000 tons. The sardines have declined by 99.5%. Gone. Pilchards, gone. And when something like pilchards disappear, everything else starts declining with them. Here we have seabirds as an example. Now, seabirds are easy to measure because they breed on islands outside the water. But what's happening to them is happening to all the other things in the water as well that feed on them. But we can't see them, we can't count them, and fisheries doesn't share any information with the public. So the seabirds give us a good idea of what's happened. The blue line here is the Cape gannet population, from 250,000 to a few thousand left today, a decline of 94%. The African penguin, a decline of 85%. The Cape cormorant, a decline of more than 65%. Why? Because they're all dependent on sardines. Why isn't this thing moving forward? Now, if someone says to you, yes, but that decline in sardines all happened before Namibia's independence, I say to you, at Namibia's independence in 1991, we had 700,000, what's that? We had 0.7 of a ton, 700,000 tons of sardines in our waters. Today, we've got 50,000. So since we've been in control of the sardines and pilchards in Namibian waters, we have a decline of 93% of the stock. That's with us Namibians being in charge, not the outside world coming and stealing from us mismanaging ourselves. Why are sardines so important? They're important because they are keystone species. They provide the high energy pathways, the flows through the marine ecosystem from plankton upwards. So here you've got your plankton. These are the sardines that are eating the plankton and then making high energy themselves as high energy food available to the larger fishes, both the commercial and the angling fishes, and of course then to the seabirds and the marine mammals. Now, if you lose half of this, or 95%, 99% of that, some of their role will be taken up by other species, gobies, jellyfish, and various things like that. Now, not much eats a jellyfish, not humans, and not much in the marine ecosystem, apart from a couple of turtles and so on. Not much can eat a jellyfish. And those gobies are very low energy food. So there's not enough energy for birds and other things to breed and to keep a healthy population. Your pyramid above that is much smaller, and your pyramid above that is much smaller. So by mismanaging this sector here so badly, you are actually curtailing the entire productivity of the marine ecosystem. And that's what we're seeing. So corruption, economic corruption, mismanagement of resources are two sides of the same coin, and they happen because systems are not working. Now, what are these systems that are not working? What are these root causes? Institutional mechanisms are faulty. Advisory bodies within sectors with government domination in that sector, where a minister has a final say with no outside accountability, where everything is contained within one ministry under one minister. There's no broader accountability. Secretiveness, no transparency on resource status by biologists, no transparency on quota recommendations, no one talking for sustainability, the long-term sustainability, no transparency on ministers' final decisions, no transparency on the economic impacts, who gets the quotas, why those people get the quotas, are they just cronies or is there a good reason for it, what are they paying for it, and so on. No external peer review and oversight, and no EIAs or SEAs for the fishing sector. They can do as they please. So when you have that set of conditions, you end up with corruption on the one hand, and you end up with resource mismanagement on the other. And that set of conditions is not peculiar only to the fishing sector. It affects all sectors where there's a rich natural resource and the decision-making is contained within government and normally within one ministry. And not only where the allocation of resources fall into that gambit, but also where the allocation of permitting and approvals fall into that. So mining licenses, environmental impact assessments. We are seeing an increasing growth of corruption across this country, getting into more and more sectors as we move forward. And it is of real concern to us, not only because of the economic component, but also because of the mismanagement of resources across the country. And now is the time where we have to move to really stamp it out. And what can we do? We need to establish councils or similar oversight bodies comprising not only government agencies, not just one ministry, but also the private sector, NGOs, academia, and others, so people can see what's happening in these institutions. There need to be regular review processes, external review processes. We need to have a much more open, transparent accountability for data and information that must be out there. You go to the Ministry of Fisheries now and you ask them anything about fish stocks. It's secret. Why is it secret? They're our fish stocks. They belong to the nation. Why should it be secret? You ask them who got the quotas. It's secret. Why is it secret? You go to the forestry and you ask, who's got quotas for timber? It's secret. It's absolute nonsense. We should introduce EIAs across all sectors in an even-handed way. And finally, the Anti-Corruption Commission has to become far more proactive. At the moment, it reacts to things. But there's part of the Act says that the Anti-Corruption Commission makes provision for them to take measures for the prevention of corruption in public bodies and private bodies. But they don't do any of that. They could be going to governments and to parliaments and pointing out all of these things here that need to be done. How all these ministries and SOEs and so on should be restructuring themselves to create transparency and have accountable institutions in place. They've done none of that. And that's what they need to do, and that's what we as a nation need to push them to do. So forestry, corrupt, but it's not the only one. And that's why I just wanted to end on this overview of corruption and what we need to do. And if we do some of these things, we'll cut across many sectors, not just fisheries and forestry. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for a very interesting talk, and I'm sure. Don't run away, because I believe there are questions, most probably. But please allow me first to rectify one thing. In the first phase, you mentioned that a local NGO was misused by German professors regarding bush thinning. I think I have to correct you there. We never said we are against, I'm the NGO, I'm managing the NGO, Earth Life Namibia, and therefore I can't resist to talk about it. We never were against debushing. We especially said debushing is very necessary to bring a better, more well-being for farmers, etc., and communities. But we were against export of the bush to Germany. So this is, I just want to state this very clear.
Well, I don't think I should allow you that last word, because debushing can only be done if there's economic drivers behind it. If the farmers can make money from the debushing, that's what drives it. And the whole emphasis is to use the economic opportunities created through debushing and charcoal and so on to drive a rangeland restoration program. And by undermining the economics of it, you essentially undermine the whole process and you prevent rangeland restoration. So I think it was a very ill-considered thing to do, and it wasn't very good for Namibia, and we're only now starting to come out of the problems that were caused by that. So I don't want you to have the last word on that.
But I have to say something to that, because I believe we can use the bush in different ways here in Namibia. We must not export it. We very soon will have a power plant by. That's true, but it could act as a sort of example how bush thinning can be done in a very good way. But all right, I see no hands. Then therefore I introduce. Yeah. Are they? Okay. Are there questions, comments?
Konrad Rödern, it's on corruption. It's beyond imagination. After Fishrot became public and was taped and screened on Al Jazeera, etc., the government still went ahead with recon. The government still was not open with the uranium leaching, which is in my eyes the biggest dangling danger over us in the short term. And have you any ideas how to reverse it? You see, it's so frivolous that they do it, although they should feel ashamed in a way. And so the culture is so different.
Yes, I'm concerned. I put EIAs up there as one of the areas where the susceptibility of corruption, because you've got these big investors coming in, working with the Office of the Environmental Commissioner, and we are seeing some things there which we are very unhappy with in that whole process. And when that legislation was first put together, I was the head of the Directorate of Environmental Affairs at that time. And we designed in the Act a Sustainable Development Advisory Council 4 people from government and 4 people from outside government. And the environmental commissioner was meant to report to that Sustainable Development Advisory Council at least for important, high-profile, conflictual type of projects. The minister at the time said, no, we don't need that. We'll keep it within the ministry. I'd left government then, and as the act was going through, they took that out and they said, we'll keep it within government. The environmental commissioner can report to the permanent secretary, now the ED, and then up to the minister. So we've got that same problem of containment within a ministry that causes so much problems in fisheries and elsewhere. So you're right, the institutional mechanisms need to be changed. Now, looking at those 2 projects, if we had that bigger, broader structure in place, it would go to that structure and they would look at things and you'd have far more broad input given into the process. Recon, for example, shouldn't have been allowed here in the first place because every geologist in the country knows there's no oil and gas there. It's just a stock market scam. The advantage of that situation compared to the uranium one is that after a few years and they find nothing, it'll fizzle out and they'll go home and they'll have made a lot of money in their pockets, inside trading and all the rest of it. We'll just be left with a few small patches that have been disturbed. But the uranium project in the Kalahari is a really concerning project, very concerning. I've just been in contact with the team leader who put the best practice guide for in situ uranium leach mining in Australia together and laid out the situation to him and explained what was happening there and asked him for his take. And he said, this is a really dangerous project. Now, he was in charge of putting the best practice guide in Australia together. And the situation in Australia where they do this leach mining, this in situ leach mining, is in aquifers and groundwater, which are so saline, they have no use for anything. They can't be used for people, they can't be used for livestock or for wildlife or anything. It's absolutely brine conditions. And it's only in those areas where they do this in situ leaching. And when he heard about the situation here, he said he would be deeply concerned about it, and including the fact that the Russians are not well known for their environmental sensitivity and compliance, and the regulator is not capable of doing the governance issues of checking and monitoring and so on. They don't have the staff to do it. You ask them and they say, sorry, we've got no vehicles, we've got no money, we can't go out. So you set up these systems, but there's no mechanism for actually implementing the systems which are set up. So it just doesn't make sense. If it was up to me, I would stop that uranium exploration right now, off the cards.
Thank you. Chris, according to your knowledge, where do the fires start? Why, the wildfires that you identified as one of the issues? What's the cause of fire being mismanaged mostly?
Up in the Northeast, it's mainly started by people. I mean, historically, you'd have your intensive grazing coming, and where you'd had huge herds coming through, savory sort of thinking, there wouldn't be much to burn, but there'd be big areas in between. Fires would come, started by lightning, they'd burn through in ungrazed areas. Nowadays, it started by people lighting all over the place. No, on purpose, they're burning just to get the, and they don't have boundaries to where they burn. So, they want to get rid of the grass around their areas. No, before that, earlier in the season, now, August, September, October. That's why the skies are so gray around Windhoek and at this time of the year. It burns right from Zambia, Zimbabwe, northern Namibia, Botswana. They think it'll regenerate the grass and so on when the rains come. And it also gets scrub away from the homesteads, no snakes coming in. There's a whole range of reasons why people do it. The problem is these multiple frequent cool burns don't give the scars on the trees time to recover. And then the fire gets into those scars again and burns into the tree and into the tree. If there was a fire every 8 or 10 years in that area, which should be good, then you'd have a hot fire coming through, setting back the scrubby thorn trees and little bits and pieces, and the trees would be recovered so they wouldn't burn through and then get burnt and fall over. So you need infrequent hot fires in those areas. In Wangi, in Wangi National Park, they had all their umurambas got full of choked with various acacias. And they couldn't work it out because they were burning and burning and burning. And then they discovered that they were burning too often and the fires weren't hot enough. So they stopped burning and they started opening up areas and letting the grass in. And then once every 10 or 12 years, they'd put a really hot fire through, and then it started to open up again. So your fire intensity and your fire frequencies are really important. Farmers in Namibia have very little clue about fire because it's been excluded legally for generations now. When the Germans came in, because fires were not good in temperate zones, they said we mustn't burn. So the whole fire was excluded from farmland. And now you speak to farmers and they're terrified of fire. They don't recognize it as part of the systems here. I grew up in KwaZulu-Natal. We had our matches out the whole time and we're burning. It's just part of our management. And here, even right in the heart of the Namib, there should be fires from time to time. As soon as the small stock farming stopped in the middle of the Namib, and places like Namibrand and Gondwana and so on started opening up big areas, we had lightning strikes. Once every 15 years or so, a lightning strike, the area would burn, and then you'd see the springbok coming in from all over the place. And if you look at the historic migration of springbok, these huge treks which used to take place, and you look at those years are not years which are drought years. Those are high rainfall years when the grass is standing like this and the springbok can't use that grass, and they trek away and they go into the Kalahari and elsewhere to find lower grazing, smaller grass or drier areas where there's been fire through where they can graze. So, they're very selective grazers, and these big treks were from too much rain, too much grass, not from looking for grass. It's interesting.
Are there more questions?
Maybe just the story about now that they're promulgating the freedom of information, Chris, should that be used to force government to be open? Because I also have a bugbear, it really bugs me. Everything is secret. And that's total nonsense to say, we are the people, that information is for us. It's not for the politicians, it's not, and they have to be accountable. And if they don't, can you not maybe name them and shame them? They signatures to CITES and places like this, get CITES to withdraw their accreditation.
Yeah, well, one would hope that act will make things available. But some of these ministries are so, fisheries wouldn't even give data on fish stocks to the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Environment and Tourism between government agencies. So, this was now under the previous minister who we are supporting with food and accommodation and his cronies. So there's a real deep problem that we have to overcome. And it takes leadership from the top to do that. And hopefully in the next round of parliaments and the next president and so on, we will have that leadership. And I think it's really important to find the people who can provide that sort of leadership and can really start addressing corruption properly. Now, this is a topic that's not really spoken about terribly openly. It comes out in the newspapers with fish rot and so on, but people are quite reticent and nervous about speaking about this sort of thing. And I thought, what the hell, let's go for it and just talk about it and put it on the table and see. And try and find some common approaches which will address it at a broader level, not just looking at the fish sector, because it's broader than the fish sector. How much do we know about the diamond sector? The diamond company, what do we know about them? Terribly secret. Why? They're our diamonds. Why is it secret? And so it goes on.
Why would a big lobby not stop?
Yeah.
Full of that. They all, I think, part of this whole fish, the rot.
I have a non-political question. For example, towns like Henties, they grew in the last years. Is there a statistic that shows the influence on weather with the trees planted there now?
Sorry, you say, is there data? There's certainly data from large areas. A place like Israel that has really invested in a greening of the whole country. You can see the climate has really changed there. Henties Bay is a very small little dot on the map like that. And planting trees there is not going to have a bigger effect other than make the conditions nicer for people, make the air cleaner and things like that. But the whole northeast of the country, the woodlands in the northeast of the country, that would make a big difference if we lost that. And it's a compounding difference, because what happens is the global temperatures go up, the atmospheric moisture levels go down, rain falls and hits the ground. If the ground's bare, it causes damage to the ground, it runs off, that which sinks in, the soil moisture level, because of the increase in heat, the lack of now shade cover, lowering humidity and all that, has a compounding effect on soil moisture. Soil moisture is the thing that drives production, and the soil moisture goes down and production goes down and more ground is exposed. So you have this vicious cycle of going down. And therefore, the more we can do to build it up and go in the opposite direction, the better we are and the whole ecosystem is and the planet is. So you know, at a very micro level, it's not going to have sort of a bigger impact, but it'll have a pleasant impact for you and your life and the people living there.
I'm Frauke Lühl. What about to make the urban people really aware of, because we are so spaced in the big country, and I'm saying that because my son architect, I told him they are busy with urban planning, and I said you must put in urban agriculture, and he said no, but it's coming. So I think because here you have a little bit more crowded people and perhaps more educated people who can understand that, to get a spot point first, to somehow, think about that, to get
I absolutely support that. I think urban and peri-urban food production is a really important thing. We've got so many people here without jobs. And we've got grey water. If we used our water properly, in my house, for example, just outside Windhoek, I capture all the rain that falls on the roof, and I've got a septic tank, which is actually a water recycling program. And that goes through into a big 30,000 litre tank, and that goes through to irrigate my vegetables. And we could be building that sort of thing with solar panels and water capture and water recycling on a large scale with all new developments here, and then have peri-urban food development, because you've got a population that can buy as well. You've got people to sell to. And I think that's really the way to go. This linked up thinking, I think, is really important. So, good point, yeah.
We should go on. Is it okay, Conrad? That was, most interesting. Thanks for the questions. And I want now to introduce Mr. Scriba, Mr. Raphael Scriba, to you. I understand that you are partly in Germany, partly in Namibia, so you work live and work parallel in both countries. Mr. Scriba is the CEO of a German Waldzertifikate International GmbH. Interesting name for a company. And you are a Diplom DES, DES dot. So can you explain what the DES is for?
Hello? Yes, first of all, I want to thank you, Chris, for this very interesting presentation. My presentation will be highlighting more on the carbon dioxide certification for forests and internationally. Um, to refer to your question, we founded Waldzertifikate International, the GmbH. It's a company founded by a partner of mine, Dr. Joachim Krug, and me. He is a doctor for forestry in Germany, and this company is specifically an international operating service provider for sustainable forest management for forest owners, enterprises, and investors. DES, Diploma DES, I have a diploma for visual communication. In that field, I'm working internationally for the media and for the television and movie industry as well. So I'm more for the, let's say, communication side responsible, and my partner is more from the scientific side. Okay, Dr. Joachim Krug has been working for over 2 decades as a scientific advisor on the protection and sustainable management of forests worldwide, with the main focus in evaluation of forests, especially in the changing importance of forests in the context of climate change, taking into account ecological and economic interests. What do I do wrong here? Okay. Because it's, yeah, das ist irgendwie nicht mehr zu lesen. Ne? Okay. Sorry for that. And so he is a professional on that. On behalf of the Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture in Germany, he was scientific advisor to the delegation of the climate regulations from 2007 to 2013. And he's appointed by TÜV Nord in Germany. That is the only verifying and validating body in Germany, as an external technical expert and responsible for all verifying certification processes. Me, myself, I just had a short excursus on that. I was working, or I'm still working for long-term cooperation for many NGOs. I'm now for over 30 years in Namibia, and at the last few years, half part living in Namibia and in Germany. So, following up to the presentation of Chris, the future of Namibia's forest. It looks, or Chris painted a very dark picture. Unfortunately, my outlook is not that much more positive, but maybe we can offer a part of a solution, how to create additional income through carbon dioxide certification. To come back to that, what Chris said as well in his presentation, true climate neutrality, which has been set for 2045 at the latest, will not be achievable without compensation of so far unavoidable emissions. The worldwide climate crisis is a fact, I think. There is no doubt about it. Chris mentioned that as well. Temperature is rising up. Our planet Earth is heating up. This is widely realized and accumulates in the international agreements from within the last decades, from Kyoto to Paris. The extant protocols demand drastic steps towards climate neutrality as soon as 2045. How can we reach these ambitious goals? First and most important, we have to avoid any emissions. That this is not easy, that this is very, very difficult, we all know. But secondly, worldwide pollution issuers will be forced to compensate unavoidable emissions by buying carbon dioxide certificates on the international markets. The aim is to avoid emitting carbon dioxide and motivating emitters to clean up their production processes. So first of all, avoid emissions, if not possible, to compensate unavoidable emissions. But therefore, our forests are our most successful tools to achieve climate neutrality. Forest carbon removal by carbon dioxide sequestration and greenhouse gas removal performance is the most important thing under human management. From now on, this will be honored, plus can literally be cashed in by carbon dioxide certificates. It is very important if it comes now to the Namibian forest. As Chris said as well, about a third of the forest in northern Namibia is diminished since 1990. If it's 25% or 30%, it is drastically, and deforestation and severe degradation continues, and that is the problem. We have to stop that. And it's a situation we are facing. So we have two scenarios: the heating up of the world climate, and at the same time, the Namibian forest is facing deforestation and degradation, and it's continuing. But our forests play a fundamental role in the fight against climate change. The protection of the remaining forests and the improvement of ecosystem services is of paramount importance, both regionally and nationally, and internationally, of course, as well. The influence of the precipitation regime and the threat of warming in central and southern Namibia with progressive desertification as a result cannot be denied. We've seen the graphics from Chris. It's heating up. Rainfall is a threat to get less and less. And if we are cutting down the northern Namibian forests, then of course it will be of very negative impact for the entire country. This negative scenario has to be turned around immediately. And yeah. But as funny as it sounds, it might be a huge chance for Namibia, because Namibia got the unique chance to protect its endangered dry forest, yet financed through international traded carbon dioxide certificates at no own costs, plus gain a remarkable income for its own communities, for example, conservancies. And that is exactly where we might face the problems that government is not reacting for whatever reasons Chris was mentioning. But now, if we can trade certificates on an international market, the protection of our forests can be supported, let's say, by the back door on an or through the international markets. If we're looking at our, at least partly still original dry forests in northern Namibia as a unique and sensitive ecosystem, it might be difficult to enable sufficient funds for the management, protection, and especially rehabilitation of forests with forest products alone. Non-wood forest products and cultural and environmental services, as well as carefully and sensitive managed ecotourism, are of great importance and should not be declined, but have as well limited markets. But climate protection services, for example, the function of forests as carbon reservoir and greenhouse gas sink, plays a central role in the fight against climate change, and it's therefore internationally sought after, and it is paid for. The basic idea might be, we call it carbon conservancies. We all know conservancies either on communal areas or even on farmlands and so on. Carbon dioxide removal certificates provide a new income opportunity for forest custodians. Maybe an example you all know is with the rhino protections. Communal areas which used to face a lot of poaching in the past are becoming custodians for their endangered species by protecting them and therefore generate a long-term income, for example, because tourism is coming into these areas, lodges are built or whatever. So it is not a one-off income by poaching these dangerous species, by poaching the rhino, but they're generating an income on a long-term base because they're working as rangers or guides or whatever. Carbon conservancies will generate a long-term income by only taking care of their own forests. They are becoming custodians of their trees. Even degraded forest areas of the dry forests can still achieve an increased sink capacity of estimated, and that is really conservatively estimated, 1 to 2 tons biomass per hectare and year. 1 ton, for example, for reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, and 1 ton for growing biomass. The market value of this increase via corresponding certificates is currently at least 20 to 50 euros and much higher on the regulated market, the ETS market, which with up to 80 to 100 euros per ton. That means, in this respect, such a carbon conservancy can generate an income of 20,000 to 50,000 euro per year on an area of 1,000 hectares. If you're looking at how big conservancies are, it adds up much more. Through direct participation, the community experience a monetary improvement. A higher sum can be called up with each tree protected or planted, or proportional loss with each tree felled. An alternative approach might be an external investor from outside. An investor takes a lease for a corresponding forest area and runs and finances afforestation initiatives in cooperation, of course, with the forest administration and local population or conservancies, for example. In return, the investor can credit the associated sink service to himself, or in that case, his company, over an agreed period of time. Such a model is widely implemented in Europe in order to reforest large areas on calamity areas at no cost to the owner. You all have watched or listened to the news, especially these European summer. For example, Germany is facing an extremely dry summer, a very hot summer. And big areas in Germany, especially the northeastern part, Sachsen-Anhalt and so on, they're facing a drought. If you're looking at big areas, the pine forest, for example, is down to 95%. Pine is not coping with the drought. The trees are getting weak. You have the problems with the Borkenkäfer, sorry, I don't have the English word for that, which weakens up the tree much more. Then we have a much more extreme wind situation with much higher speed. So huge areas of former pine forest plantations are broken down and of no commercial use anymore. So a forest owner is sitting or is confronted with a situation. First of all, he's not generating any income out of his forest, but has to replant something with a new species, which is coping with a changing climate, actually, with higher temperatures, less rainfall, and so on. So, and for these areas that are a good example for a forest investor trying to rehabilitate these areas, and at the end of the day can credit these associated zinc service for his company. So it will help both. It will help the forest owner as well as the companies or the emittents, for example. For Namibia, this could result in scalable financing for afforestation projects. What are the requirements? What might be the way forward? Up to date, in Namibia, we need urgently a forest inventory. We need really new data to know exactly where are we standing now, what are the baseline, where are we, how is the focus for the future? All of the financing options mentioned above are based on that current forest inventory, adjusted to the desired certification on the international market. So the data we are requiring have to be in line for the certification on the international market. We always have to look, what do we want to achieve? What are the requirements? And therefore, we have, from the beginning, we have to look for this required data. Only the latest reliable forest data enable a reliable baseline for further calculations and successful planning. Modern data collection can look like remote sensing methods, based on microlight drones or satellite, can also reliably map large areas. It is not anymore that people are going into the forest, or the need for the people going into the forest and checking each and every tree. That can be done on a much quicker and much more modern way. The latest techniques and programs should be made available to the Namibian partners in order to support them in future-orientated forest data collection. The Carbon Conservancy project can be taken over by Namibian partners at a relatively short time. In addition, the project would have a significant role model function and radiance into regions with comparable conditions. Similar projects are at the moment already launched in Zambia, for example, in Ethiopia or Kenya. Again, a summary. Why carbon dioxide certificates? The positive reverse of degradation and destruction of the Namibian dry forests only through external financing via international certificates for the benefit of Namibia and its people. So we don't have to wait for government to finance that or come into action. We can do that via international external financing. Large-scale afforestation projects, the most efficient options to increase greenhouse gas removals, can be financed externally via certificate trading. Both the protection of existing forests and reforestation projects help the Namibian state to fulfill the nationally determined contribution. Namibia, by the way, has signed these as well, but I think at the moment it is not through government that they are aware of that they have to get neutral 2045 as well. and how to fight climate change by reducing emissions and increasing greenhouse gas removal. Just to explain, we have a steadily growing carbon dioxide market ranging up to currently average of 85 euros. That was a few months ago. It's already higher per certificate. And to explain, a certificate is equals to 1 removed ton CO2, and that equals roughly to 1 square meter of timber. So coming back to our example to the what did I say? Cubic meter, yeah, sorry. To coming back to our example with the carbon conservancy, if you're just looking as an example, 1,000 hectares, a hectare, just 100 by 100 meter, I think that is not very optimistic to if we calculate 1 cubic meter, meaning 1 ton of CO2, meaning 85 euros per certificate. That should be, I think we should achieve. And that means it can be, these model can be a way, on one hand, to protect our forest, to do reforestation, as well, getting that financed, getting an impact, getting an income for conservancies or even private partners. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scriba. That was interesting, and let's all plant trees. So there are questions. Wiebke? Were you first?
Who is the Namibian partner? Who buys the certificate? The government? And is it possible to buy it privately? Because, I mean, if it's left to government?
Of course, you can buy privately as well, but the idea behind is that emittents, let's say, for example, an example out of nowadays, if you're looking at Europe, the discussion is going very much in the way of renewable energies to avoid, for example, old power stations which are powered by fossil energies. We can't switch them off immediately because Europe or Germany is an industrialized country. We need that energy, and the way is leading towards, let's say, solar power, wind energy, whatever, but there are still emittents which are producing a lot of carbon dioxide, like these power stations, or you're looking at an industry like car manufacturers or whatever. So there are emittents, they can't avoid from now to tomorrow, avoid their carbon dioxide. So, but they are forced to compensate their emissions. So they are interested in buying these certificates. They have to. Up to a very few years ago, it was extremely cheap for them. And they even got certificates from government, because government knows, I mean, if immediately they're, let's say, punished by, they have to buy it, then the whole industry will break down. So, but in future, it will be more and more that these certificates you have to buy are forcing your production to become cleaner. Yeah. So they are traded on an international market. So if these certificates are audited under these international rules, they can be traded on the international market. It doesn't have to be a government person. No, no. It is. Sorry? For example, if you're a forest owner, if you're a conservancy, and you're going to this entire validating process, then it is an official certificate will be written out, and this official certificate can be traded on the international market. A conservancy, for example, or we make it much more simple. You're a forest owner. You're whatever. Yeah. Yeah, but it's the same. I mean, you have to have a forest, otherwise the system won't work. Or you have a barren land where you say, okay, I have whatever, 500 hectares, and now I'm reforest or do reforestation and planting trees. Then you can apply for that as well. Sorry? Yeah, okay, we have to check if it's so easy to reforest the desert. Okay, Chris mentioned that. I mean, Israel, for example, is doing something like this. It's greening up the desert. That is a different story. But in generally, yeah, could be.
The conservancies, there are certain areas that will work very well. People in the desert are not going to be able to make money. The north. By satellite, the people doing GIS should be able to come up, with how many trees, and if there's a forestry conservancy, and have you got one conservancy who might be interested in doing this? You get it off the ground and publicize it.
There are two questions, actually. I mean, the validation can be done as that via satellite or via microlight, so you can map a huge area, and then you see, okay, what is the data up to now? And that is what the way forward will be. We have to have a forest inventory because our data at the moment is quite old. It is sometimes, I mean, still from the South African times. So we have to have the up-to-date data, that we have a baseline from what we can calculate. That we say, okay, this is, let's say, a forest we can improve by reforestation. We can improve whatever, 2 tons, 3 tons per hectare per year, for example. That can be done.
The way I see it, if you then can persuade a conservancy to get involved with that, that could also be, if you can reforest, that will help unemployment. You could, from the money that is being paid, they could pay some of their own people to actually then plant trees that can be certified as well. So
that is now a different aspect, how we can help with unemployment in that areas, that on top, of course. But I think the major idea behind is we can, first of all, we can protect our Namibian forest. We can finance reforestation, and not by waiting to the government, for the government to being the initiative or bringing the money in. If we just think about Chris' presentation, with all the hiccups and all the problems in the past, we know it all. If it's corruption, if it's whatever, peer not being interested or so on. So that is now, might be now an option to go on an own way.
I'm just with you just now, just a second. There's one question from online asking from online. This is, yeah. How long are these certificates valid?
Yeah. That is exactly very important, this question, because we are normally looking at about 30 years for how we are evaluating these specific forests or whatever. It is not for a help for anybody if we are just on a short term, a year or two. It has to be on a long term to actually reverse the negative process of cutting down the forests, what we're facing in Namibia. So we have to look on a long-term base.
Well, because you're pregnant, you get.
Yes, thank you. I do have a question. The main topic is on forests. So according to classification, Namibia has forests only in the north, but we have acacia savannas in most of the country. Do they also count for these certificates, or don't they count for these certificates? Because there are big trees. I mean, you've seen a camel thorn tree. There are big trees, there are special trees, and they also produce CO2 and all the carbons that you need. So do they also count or not?
Thank you. The same as we said before on the other presentation, of course, urban space, even your garden and so on, is very important, planting trees or having shade and so on. I mean, the example is very simple. If you have a garden even in town and you have shades, you feel it that the microclimate is much better than if you have a barren ground and so on. But for this model with carbon dioxide certificates, it's becoming a bit difficult. For example, if you're looking at the south, where you have more savanna, grassland, and of course there are a few big trees in, and they're important as well. But we have to look on figures, on numbers as well, if you are talking about certificates. If you have a hectare and then you say, okay, there is maybe an increase of biomass of 50 kilograms because on this savanna landscape, you have one or two small little trees coming up, then it is somehow, it might be a bit difficult for a certificate. So I'm not saying that it's not important, but with a certificate, it is a bit, it's a bit smaller on that way.
Especially if you go more central Namibia, there is places where there's not only one or two in a hectare, but there's 50 trees. That's big trees.
I think that special situations someone has to check. Of course, if somebody has a farm of 5,000 hectares and somehow in the central area, it is a question if it makes sense to go there and make evaluation and checking how much can we increase or what are the figures if you're focusing on the next 10, 20, 30 years. What is really the biomass increasement we can expect? I mean, I can't answer this question now because it is very specific now for your example. But I'm not saying no, of course. But for sure it's possible. And as I said, I mean, we can force it up if you do, for example, you're planting trees, for example. If you say, hey, I'm not doing any farming anymore, but I now start planting trees and the environment might be right and there's enough water and so on, then it might be an idea. But from out of the blue, I mean, it's very difficult to answer if that is really a solution or workable solution.
Thank you. Raphael, I have a question, but I also want to explain why I'm asking it. Will you be measuring just solid wood as a representation of carbon sink? Or would you be measuring soil carbon? And I think, you know, we learned so much, especially from Australia, that the climate gases that are really, you know, it's not just carbon, it's also water vapor. And all of that is really measurable in the soil. So how would you do the accounting, and how would the accounting, what would be tested? What would be compared with the you know, with the original state in which the environment was, or that landscape was, and then, you know, the carbon sinking or the climate gas sinking or not?
And may I add methane gas, probably?
Carbon? This model is, sorry. This model is mainly based on biomass increasement. So that means you have 1 hectare, you make a valuation how much biomass, how much tons of biomass are above ground. And okay, that's 2 different things. I mean, you're focusing towards biochar, I think, as well. Yes, yes, but that's how we can work on that as well, because otherwise you would promote just plantations, because then you could increase. Now, I mean, that would be the negative side, and that is what we don't want, because then you could say, okay, I'm just planting a plantation of 1 crop or one species, and then I just increase my biomass. That is not the way how it goes, because on the long run, we are, and that is why we are focusing on the still partly original dry forest in northern Namibia, because it has a diversity. It is not like in Europe you have just a pine forest, or in South Africa where you have a pine forest and every 30 years it will be chopped off and goes to the sawmill. So, and that is on a long term, that is sustainable forest management, sustainable. Otherwise, as I said, I mean, you have, like in South Africa, you have a pine forest, just a monoculture pine forest. Every 30 years, it's been chopped off and goes into the sawmill. And but to protect this natural environment, like the dry forest in the north, plus to rehabilitate, that is actually what, at the end of the day, will be audited. No, and the different species as well. But I mean, you have, for example, in Europe, you have all these figures from the forestries. In Germany, if you're a forest owner, you have to have actual data at least every 5 years. So the forestries are checking your forest and exactly making your data available. And on this data, we have the baseline that we say, okay, that is a status quo now, where we are now, this piece of land with these forests, that looks like this. But how can we increase it? How can we? You want to have a forest with different species, first of all, a diversity, because that is a healthy forest. And then you need a forest with different age groups. Not only one age group, because 30 years ago, you make a plantation of pine, and after 30 years, you cut them all off, and then you start again. But you want to have a diversity in species as well as in age. So you have these, how do you call it, the three level forest, you know, young, and some of the species are capable more of, let's say, in the shade of another tree and so on. And if this tree is being able to harvest, then the other tree comes back and so on. And that these renewing of the forest, like it is in the natural, in the nature used to be, that is where you actually, what you actually want to achieve as well. So, and that is the highest, or that is the best, most diverse, most resistible forest you can have. The natural forest.
Thanks, Raphael. I'll be brief. Based on the theme, how to create additional income through CO2 certification, can you just give us a practical example of a success story where this was done, and considering the conservancies anywhere in the world? Can you just give us a practical example where these certificates are being traded internationally? Thank you.
In Namibia, it is quite new. That is not practice in Namibia, but as I said, there are examples done in Ethiopia, in Kenya, and in Zambia. It was, I think, a few weeks ago, it was in the news as well, that conservancies in Zambia run through that project and qualified for this additional income. So these certificates were internationally marketed, and then these conservancies have been have been funded for that as well. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much, Raphael. I have a very simple question. There was always the talk of, or you mentioned it will be certified, but who certifies? Who produces the product of the certificates that are actually then traded on the market?
There are clear guidelines for certifications. Only these international certificates can be traded on that market. Of course, anybody could write a certificate. You have 1 hectare and you are doing well and so on, and somebody can come and say, okay, I certify you done this and that. And if you find somebody who says, okay, nicely, I pay you therefore $100, fine. Nobody can say anything against. But if you want to trade on an international market to these set conditions, then of course you have to run through a validation and to an audit by experts which are internationally accepted. And like Dr. Jo Krug, who's an expert who is certified by TÜV Nord, that means he is able to do a validation, for example, which goes into a certificate from WWF, a gold standard, or Vera, which are international certificates. And these certificates, they are tradable internationally. That means if you got a certificate for a certain amount, it is like US dollars or whatever. You can put them in your safe, and then in a year's time or in 5 years' time, maybe this is even increased money-wise, and then you can trade that. And if you're an emittent, that was happened in the past, for example, they bought certificates at a very, very low price, keep them, and now where the certificates are much more expensive, then they put them on the market and can compensate their emissions.
There are two more questions. Okay. Sorry, I didn't see.
It is totally okay. I have only one practical question to both speakers. um, I was thinking in Germany we have different ideas how we create a new forest. We plant trees, or we try to let the wind work, or we zone work, that some new trees can grow. It is also in Namibia possible that we can that we have not so many costs for plants, because in Germany you plant 10,000, 12,000 trees on a hectare, and that's very expensive. And maybe we can lower the plant costs, that the forester or that the farmers have more ideas to do that, because the costs are not so high.
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, one of the problems, if you look at our forests in Namibia, our woodlands, our deciduous woodlands, they come down as far as they can, and the cutoff mark is set by the rainfall. And they stop there where the rainfall gets too low. Now, with climate change, that rainfall belt is going up. So natural regeneration is less likely. That's why we must protect everything we've got, because once a big tree is there, the rainfall can go down. But it's that germination and those first years. And even as it is, we see cohorts of trees at different sizes where there have been a couple of good years that have allowed the tree to go, and then you've got that level of tree, and then that level of tree, and nothing in between. They've died because the years weren't good enough. So yeah, we can rely on natural regeneration further north amongst the woodlands. Around that certain, and particularly in some of the cleared fields, natural regeneration is certainly a thing. It can be augmented with planting a few big trees in between as well. And one can encourage that, particularly with fruit trees, indigenous fruit trees, because people always protect those around their homesteads. So a combination of natural regeneration, planting, and really protecting, particularly the margins, the edges of these forests are really important, because if you lose those, they won't regrow. And even if you plant, you have to water and water and water to keep them going, so it becomes a problem. Yeah. There are projects. If we had a fund, some of those mechanisms I discussed, and we paid people around villages and schools and so on for every tree, provide nurseries, set up nurseries around the country, and people take 100 trees and they plant them. For every tree that's there at the end of the year, they get a few dollars out of this carbon dioxide fund. And after 8 or 10 years, then they can plant the next batch of trees, because now 8 or 10 years, they're big enough to be on their own. And then you get the next one going, and the next one's going, and the next one's going. If we can create incentives to actually pay people not only to have trees, but to look after them and bring them up to 8 or 10 years, and then they can plant the next patch and the next patch and the next patch, that probably holds the biggest opportunity for getting things going.
Yeah, I think that is very important by the whole program as well, that we are not trying to plant intruders or other trees, but we have to look at a natural environment here and planting indigenous trees. But I think your project, Chris, with carbon dioxide, it can add up. Because if you say, okay, you give the money for planting one tree, we have to look on a long-term base. I mean, that's the reason why we are looking at 30 years, for example, because otherwise you're planting one tree and for 1 year, and after 5 years, this tree is eaten up by a goat or whatever, and then it doesn't help, and then you start with scratch again. So I think it is very important to continue, and from these small little islands to enlarge.
I allow two more questions because we have to come to an end. Should I?
Okay, my question is now, for example, I'm next to Goyangab Dam, got my 12-hectare land swollen by the city, so I can't hold my sheep or whatever. So I decide to plant, for example, 5-hectare mulberry trees to silk production, 5-hectare apple trees, and then 2 hectares for pig production. And then I need a really dense canopy for mushroom production. So this is creating workspace in the settlement area, and it's a lot of trees and a good cyclists for the pigs, for example, you can produce methane. But I can't finance this. Is there any way that it's possible that it's financed through Waldzertifikate?
To get that clear, it's not financed by us, by Waldzertifikate, but by the carbon dioxide certificates. Yeah. We have to make a difference between a forest of forest areas which are destroyed or cut down or degraded, or if you now setting up a plantation, which actually that is what that example is you mentioned. So before it was Greenland, for example, for cattle or sheep or whatever, and now you are planting apple trees or whatever. I think that is a different story. I doubt we really have to look specific into that, if that will fall under these certifications. I doubt a bit, because it's something else. Oh, Chris, what do you think?
Think about Windhoek would be a urban carbon conservancy. How would you evaluate this? And could it be done? A certain space, city, we talked about urban agriculture. How would you evaluate, for instance, if we say Windhoek will be a urban carbon conservancy, and how can we?
I think we should not mix up between agriculture and forestry. You for sure know about this project. Maybe it is still in the making. From what was this architect who tried to green up the Klein Windhoek Revier from Avis up to Katutura areas and so on. Bana, exactly, yeah. No question, it would be a very good, interesting idea. It would doing very well for all Windhoekers as a green lung, as a recreational area, and so on and so on. I mean, especially if it's like a green river bed, even if it's only partly of the year is flowing with water, it would be doing very good. I think for the microclimate as well, for the entire city, it would be a very good project. But I doubt that we can rate that under carbon conservancy. And we really have to look into that specifically. I mean, I don't want to say yes or no, but I mean, that is it's so, because it's so specific. But on the other hand, as I said, if that would be qualify for a carbon dioxide certificate, internationally market, I doubt. But on the other hand, I mean, if you say, okay, here we're doing that, and you find a sponsor who says, I'm willing to pay for that because I can rate myself as being a green with a green thumb. Let's say like a lot of projects worldwide, it's a bit like greenwashing. You know, you're buying a case of Krombacher pills and therefore you're financing 1 square meter of rainforest somewhere in the Amazonas area. That is a different thing. If you can obviously find something like that, but for these certificates, I think it is not. Yeah, but it. I will support that, but if that is a
All right, it's a most interesting and complicated topic. And I think we go to the last question, Konrad.
Yes, carbon and certification. I followed this since 1998, and I had a discussion with Dr. Hermann Scher, who went for cost-reflective solar, and it gave us, starting in Germany, the solar potential we have today. Without this feed-in law, we would not have to talk about renewable energy helping the world. And he told me, you know, this carbon credit thing is a whole bazaar. The Anglo-Americans like it, but cost of certification and the fraud in giving out cheap certificates to industry. And we must remember what we call a corrupt government. In Germany, it's a lobbied government. It's just a different name, 700 parliamentarians and 7,000 lobbyists in Berlin alone. So until now, that model, it's not a new model, has failed. Why do you think it will now take off? And just to end, what is the price of a certification? How is your price list?
There have been several aspects you mentioned. I mean, I don't want to go into a deeper discussion what government is corrupt and if German government is a lobby government. That will not lead the way forward. The model is not brand new, you're absolutely right. But what is new is that worldwide, it is declared that we have to get neutral on 2045. You and me, we both know it will be a very, very difficult way. And if we reach that, and if we reach the goal of only 2 degrees more of the world climate, I can't answer this question, definitely not. But we have 2 ways. We can either proceed like we did the last decades as well, and then we definitely will reach these 2 degrees, maybe even in 5 years, with all the negative effects, or we can try to find solutions. By signing these protocols from Kyoto to Paris, the world actually declared we have to get neutral. That means costs are involved for emittents, and these costs are getting higher each and every year. So whereas a power station 10 years ago didn't thought about how much carbon dioxide it blows out into the air, nowadays it's a cost factor for them because they're not allowed to do that without any compensation anymore. And this cost factor will increase every year. And you see it on at the market that the certificates are having an extreme increase during the last 2-3 years. actually this year, from beginning of that year, the prices are nearly doubling up for these certificates. So that is a regulative. So every production, if you are a power station, if you are producing a washing machine or whatever, will be calculate a certain cost factor for their footprint. So that means us as well. If you're driving your Land Cruiser and it uses 20 liters diesel on 100 kilometers, the price for the diesel will be regulated by your carbon dioxide footprint as well. So on this percentage of the diesel will be, growing up as well. So even the market, or each of us here buying a car or buying a liter of diesel or whatever, buying a washing machine, at the end of the day, we are just at the beginning, but at the end of the day, your carbon footprint will be calculated in that as well. The next step is a washing machine, which may be from AEG or whatever, is double the price than a cheap washing machine from China, is at the end of the day then more valuable or more for you as a consumer, more interested, because it keeps running for 20 years and not breaking down after 3 years of warranty is over. And all these, at the end of the day, has to be calculated in as well. Recycling of resources. We can't afford to just using more and more resources. They end. They have an end somehow. But okay, that is the discussion which goes longer and longer, and to extending that presentations act, I think. Cost of certification. Yeah. I said the validation is different steps. First of all, we need the baseline. What is the inventory, the forest inventory? Then it's different steps of validating that up to the certification. And as bigger an area is, you're working on statistics. That means, as I said before, there is not somebody going into the forest and counting each and every tree, but you can do it via satellite and so on. So the bigger an area is, you can calculate on an average, on the statistic, and then you can make a progressive growth and working out a model, what to expect in 5 years or 10 years, depending on the measure, on the programs you're running, what you're doing, if you're planting trees, or if you're just avoiding that, if you're calculating on a natural growth, or if you're calculating on natural reforestation and so on. So I can't say, okay, for this hectare, it costs this and that. I mean, we have to look at bigger. No, you can't do like that. It is how big is an area and so on. It is affordable, and it is even affordable in Europe, where you can say, okay, if you start with whatever 500 hectares, because in Europe or in Germany, you're looking at a lot of forest owners which are only owning 2 or 5 or 10 hectares. Of course, for them, it makes no sense to go the whole process of a certification. But if you're if they're forming a sort of a body with 100 forest owners, and each and everybody has 5 hectares, then we're looking at 500 hectares, and then it is definitely affordable, especially we are looking at a 30-year period, not for 1 or 2 years, but it is quite from a certain extent. It will be financing itself by selling certificates. At the end of the day, it will be, the cost will be rehabilitated.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Scriba, and thank you, Chris. And thank you all for the many questions. It shed a bit of light, but I think it's a complicated issue, not so easy to understand, not too easy. I don't know, but I hope we go home with a little bit of more information and thinking about questions and asking Mr. Scriba. His email is on the board. Right, with this, I close the evening, and I hope you all have a good way home. Thank you very much.